All right, welcome to this episode of Photo Theology. I'm your host, Doug, and today we're going to be looking at the Nikon D7100 versus the Pentax K5 IIs. Now, Nikon has just debuted their D7100 to the world, and one of the reasons why it's very fitting that we take the Pentax K5 IIs is because the Nikon D7100 actually uses the same kind of filtering system that is supposed to produce a greater form of resolution by removing the anti-aliasing aspect from creating an image with a digital camera. So understand what you're going to be looking at here is a technological concept that has been brought about through multiple manufacturers, or is being brought about, I should say, through multiple manufacturers. But the guys who have, I would say, who have touted it the loudest at this point in time has been Pentax, in addition to Nikon. And, well, here we go. So here's how the test breaks down. To begin with, the raw files were processed through Corel. That's number one. Processed into a TIFF, and then processed into a JPEG. That's how it worked. Now, the processing that took place in Corel was a very simple process of me simply just clicking balance. Now, what this means by me using the balancing setup in Corel is that it evened out all the exposures, all the colors, the tone, so on and so forth, along with, I want to say, the white balance and whatnot, based on the core architecture that the manufacturer implants in the camera to create the raw file that it does. Okay, so that's why I chose balance. Now, you will notice a drastic difference between the Pentax and the Nikon, and we will get to that later on in our discussion. Your ISO range is going to range from 100 to 12,800, okay, or 12,800. That's how that's going to play out. So this is a very straightforward test. The Pentax's resolution has been interpolated, so the Nikon should have the home court advantage here because it is using a native 24 megapixel resolution. So we have that. With this test, what we're going to be looking at is we're going to be looking at the main key selling themes that Nikon is trying to tout about the D7000. So this is the real thing we're going after here in this setup. So I'm going to be talking about some things that you should find somewhat interesting. And if you don't already know them, well, you'll learn something. If you do already know them, well, then you won't be surprised. You'll just be validated in your knowledge. But this is going to be a little different from some of the other ones that I've done. Like, when I did the Nikon, the D800 versus the Pentax, K5 II, and how the K5 II just utterly trounced the D800 E. This isn't going to be one of those kind of setups. What we're going to be doing is we're going to be going after the main crucial pieces of what makes the Nikon a sellable unit. So, to begin with, let's get down to it. We're going to be looking at the sensor, all right, of the camera. Okay, so the way this camera is structured is actually structured a little differently than other Nikon cameras. It uses the 24 megapixel sensor system that is found in the Nikon D5200. Now, this sensor in nature is not a Sony sensor. This sensor in nature is a Toshiba sensor. Now, does that make a difference? Well, I guess you can look at the image and you can decide for yourself if it does. But truthfully, if I had to sit up here and think about it, where I would be critical of it is the generational aspect of it. So the Sony sensor's been around for a while now. The 16 megapixel sensor that Nikon used in the D7000. So the concept of retooling that sensor and perfecting that sensor is what you see in the Pentax K5 II and the K5 IIs. Where Nikon decided to go with a completely different sensor after dealing with the Sony 16 megapixel sensor. And the problem is this, is that you end up at square one again. So sometimes it's not always best to just run out and say, man, you know what, this here is the latest and greatest in terms of sensor technology, or at least we believe that, by the way. And we want to go with this. Sometimes it actually makes more sense to keep what you have and see how far you can push it. Now, I'm sure Nikon had various reasons to why they wanted to go with the Toshiba sensor. And I'm sure that, later on down the road, it's going to play out in other products to why, this was a better venture for them versus sticking with the Sony sensor. But when looking at the two setups, keep in mind, the Nikon sensor is a 24 megapixel sensor. The Pentax sensor is only a 16 megapixel, which has been interpolated to match the Nikon's 24 megapixel resolution. Now, one thing that I do have to point out is, aside from the sensors, you still have the imaging processors. So Nikon uses their Speed 3 imaging processor. This is found in their D4, their biggest gun. And Pentax uses their Prime 2 imaging engine, or imaging processor. It's a relationship between a sensor and a processor that makes the best of the image. It's that relationship. And that relationship ultimately dictates the colors, the tones, the dynamic range, the sharpness, the contrast. It plays into all of those things. And as we go through and, see the various ISO ranges, and as we go through and see the distortion that will inevitably happen due to higher ISO ranges, the imaging processor is what's really responsible for when, that relationship goes down south. When you start hitting, that 32, that 64, that 12,000, or that 25,000, or that, 5,200 ISO range, when you start hitting those heavy ISO ranges, it really is down to the imaging processor and what it's capable of doing. Now, one thing I do have to point out is one of the reasons why Nikon may not have went with the Sony 24 megapixel system is because it is a full frame system. So Sony's 24 megapixel sensor is a full frame 24 megapixel sensor. I'm talking about the one found in the A65 and in the A77 and in the A99. So I want to point that out, and that may be exactly why Nikon said, you know what, we'll go to Toshiba and see what Toshiba has for us. In the realm, though, of looking at the relationship between the Nikon paired with the Toshiba sensor versus the Sony being compared with the Pentax sensor, it's clear to see. The first thing you'll notice is the level of brightness that you have between the two of them. Okay, the Pentax is brighter. The reason for this is because I put it on balance. What the balance does is it balances out the dynamic range throughout the entire image. So common sense will tell you, based on these two images alone, the Pentax has a greater dynamic range set. Now, truthfully, the Pentax does. One of the big downsides that Nikon, unfortunately ran into with the D7000 was the fact that that thing could not do exposure control to save its life in terms of dynamic range. Meaning that if you tried to fix a shadow here, you got overexposure over here. You tried to fix, an overexposure here, then you got, a shadow over here. It was very complicated for Nikon to work around the Sony 16 megapixel sensor. On the flip side of that though, Pentax with their K5 had no problem. And clearly, as you can see here, the K5 IIs and / the K5 II, because they both use the same sensor setup, don't have that problem. So that's why you have the brightness that you see there with the actual Pentax model versus the Nikon D7100. That's why you have that brightness difference. Now, let's talk about tones, color tones, and saturation. Clearly, you can see that the Nikon color tones are off. I don't think anybody in their right mind would sit up here and say that the Nikon color tones are on. They are heavily subdued, and it's almost like, in a sense, you have even a lack of saturation. Once again, this is what happens when you go on a date for the first time. And when you talk about the Toshiba sensor with the Speed 3 processor, that's virtually what Nikon has done here. They're going out on a date with Toshiba for the first time, and this is what's coming of it. Now, because and I will say this, the lack of saturation and the lack of tonage may actually help the camera when it comes to its ISO performance. So, in terms of the Nikon D7100, Nikon may have looked at this and said, you know what, we're purposely going to gear the camera this way because it allows us to fix our noise issues this way. I've seen that done before. So, if you ever deal, I want to say, in Photoshop, or if you ever deal, I want to say, with the higher ISOs and stuff like that, just from a photo editing end, you do know that you can subdue noise through lack of saturation, through, I want to say, slightly modifying tones and stuff like that. You can do those kind of things. And there are other tricks up, a person's sleeve that they can actually, do as well. How you play with the gamma and so on and so forth, But when you look at this, you have this night and day difference here in terms of the reds, in terms of the greens, in terms of the yellows, in terms of the blues. Simply put, there is no safe haven that Nikon has when it comes to the colors and the tones. I mean, you're talking almost like a burgundy when it's supposed to be red. I mean, that is how different this is. And in addition to that, when you talk about, the dynamic range and all that, just piled on it, the Pentax gives this vibrant, lively image, where the Nikon, the D7100, gives, an almost death-like, we're going to a funeral scenario. So that really doesn't play in the favor of the Nikon. Now, sharpness. When it comes to sharpness, I would actually say, looking at the image, they're roughly about the same. They really are. I think that the Nikon is sharper on some of the threading. but I also think the Pentax is sharper, you know, on the wicker and on, you know, some of the bottles and so on and so forth. The other thing that we have to point out about the Pentax is that it still retains the proper colors. And when you talk about sharpness, you know, you can't sit up here and say, oh wow, my image is sharper, but I've stripped out, you know, all of the vibrant color in my image. Because that's not a fair way to judge sharpness. Of course your image is going to be sharper because you stripped out all the colors, which allows you to reallocate definition, reinforce it in your image that way. So that's something that has to be pointed out here when we talk about the sharpness. So when you look at this and you say, well, okay, how does sharpness actually affect the image? Well, it can affect the image in the way of colors, and it can affect the image in the way of actual definition that can be brought about. So with the d7100, it may have been once again, a strategical move by Nikon to say, hey, look, we're going to subdue the colors, we're going to, you know, shift the tones so that we can maximize on this concept of resolution. Remember, Pentax had already set the bar with the K5 IIs, because obviously it's been out a hell of a lot longer than the Nikon, you know, in comparison. The d7100, the d7100 just came out. So from Nikon's perspective, they've had basically an entire, you know, season, you know, to look at the Pentax models and say, okay, how can we get on their same level? Because remember, the Nikon D800E, which was supposed to have the superior resolutions, was ultimately defeated by the Pentax K5 II just by interpolating its image. And that unit runs twice as much as the Nikon D7100. So it's nice to see that Nikon has actually, I want to say, gone to the drawing board to try to, you know, rectify some of these, you know, misunderstood elements of the camera. But that's something that I want you guys to think about when you think about these images, when you think about the colors, the tones. Like I said, all you honestly have to do is just look at the color palette. It's really not that complicated. You look at that color palette, it tells you everything. About the only thing Nikon has going for it is the color black and the color white. Those are about the only two colors on that color palette that look natural in the way that they should. Now let's be serious, you know, here for a moment. How hard is it to screw up the color black and white? And what you'll see with the Nikon, if you look close enough, is you'll see even like your pinks and your purples and everything in between that's been stripped away of its saturation. But not just stripped away of saturation, the tonage has been set off as well. You know, in one sense, you could say this is an indictment of the Toshiba sensor if you really wanted to. Or you could say this is an indictment of Nikon's inability to create an imaging processor solely for the Toshiba sensor that actually gives the unit the ability to process the colors and the saturations properly. Just because an imaging processor comes out of a camera that runs $5,000 or $6,000 or $10,000 or, you know, how many thousands more our minds want to conjure up, that doesn't mean that it belongs in a lower tier camera that's not using the same sensor in terms of architecture for the imaging processor to work off from. You know, that's like taking a Fuji sensor and then giving it to Sony and say, here, use your imaging processor and make it happen. Or it's like taking a Fuji sensor and giving it to Canon and say, hey, use your Digix 5 processor with this. Sometimes these ideas aren't necessarily always the best. Now, autofocusing speed. I love this. Okay, so the Nikon d7100 basically uses the same autofocusing system as the Nikon d300. The Pentax K5 IIs uses a vastly enhanced autofocusing system that is based off of the K5. Now, we need to think about this for a moment here because this is really important. Nikon's big seller is the fact that they have 51 autofocusing points. That's the big seller here. They've got 51 autofocusing points. And also, to a much lesser extent, of that 51, they have a multitude of cross-focusing points. Now, on paper, the fact that the D7100 uses the same autofocusing system as the D300, which the D300 is, I want to say, an entry-level Nikon sports, camera. Or was, anyways. A person looks at that and says, man, you know what? That means this thing's autofocusing is totally awesome. But you got to look at a couple things here, and we're going to go through these things because this is very important when you're talking about the camera. The first thing is this. The Nikon D7100 goes down to a -2 exposure value. A -2. The Pentax, the K5 II / the K5 IIs, because they both are the same in this, goes down to a -3 exposure value. Now, -2 to -3, there's a big difference there. There's quite a big difference there. That means the Pentax can have next to little to no light, practically speaking, from a camera's perspective. And it can autofocus on the fly. That's what it has the ability to do. The Nikon, on the other hand, struggles. But the reality between the two cameras is that the Pentax can still hit that lower note that the Nikon can't. So when you're going into a low-lit situation, quite honestly, do you want to go with the camera that's a -2 or do you want to go with the camera that has the -3? That's the kind of thing that you have to think about when you think about the Nikon's autofocusing system versus the Pentax's autofocusing system. It's not about the cross autofocusing points and all that. It's not about 51 autofocusing points. It's not about that. It's about, hey, when I walk into this situation, based on the lighting, who's going to serve me better? Which model's going to do that? Also, you talk about speed. We talk about autofocusing speed. So the Nikon's autofocusing speed, if it's based off of the D300, all right, the D7100's autofocusing speed is roughly going to be about a 0.22 to a 0.20. It's going to be in that range. Where the Pentax's autofocusing speed is going to be about a 0.1 or lower. That is correct. You heard me. The Pentax K5 II / K5 IIs's autofocusing speed is at that level. You are talking at a point 1 or lower for the autofocusing speed. Now, why does that matter? Why is that relevant? What does that play into when we're talking about cameras and autofocusing? Well, it works like this. When it comes to lenses, you basically have 3 kinds of lenses that you get to pick from in just camera, SLR lenses in terms of their setups in general. You have economy, you have performance, and then you have premiere. Your economy, the way it's going to work is it's going to have an impaired autofocusing setup to it, and it's going to be weak and low lit situations. That's how an economy lens works. A performance lens is going to do better on the autofocusing end of things, but is still going to be somewhat weaker in low light. And then a premiere lens is going to do excellent when it comes to autofocusing, and it's going to do excellent when it comes to low light. Now, there is some math that goes into this when you talk about lenses and autofocusing capability. In other words, I can gauge, for example, just by reading, about a lens and how the manufacturer has set it up in terms of how they built it, I can easily gauge exactly, how this thing is going to perform in terms of speed when it's put onto a camera body. So let's do a test. Sorry about that. Let's do a test. So when you're looking at these lenses, I want you to think of an economy lens as having a multiplier of 4, a performance lens having a multiplier of 2, and a premiere lens having a multiplier of 1. The multiplier represents the level of effectiveness in terms of time that it's in sync with the actual autofocusing system of the actual camera. Now, the reason why this is important is because for the money, for the price of the Nikon with its kit lens, it runs, I want to say, roughly about $1,600. That's where it sits right now. The Pentax, the K5 IIs / K5 II, are in a very unique situation where you are able to pick up the 17-70 performance-based lens. Now, the reason why this is important is because of the fact that the Pentax's autofocusing system is so much better than the Nikon's when you compare them in terms of overall autofocusing speed and performance. On the wide, the Nikon, the d7100, is going to autofocus in, we'll say, an average lit situation. On the wide with its 18-105, you're looking at roughly about a 0.8, a 0.9 with its economy lens, where the Pentax is going to autofocus at a 0.2 with its performance lens. Now, when I'm talking about, an average, lighting scenario, I'm talking about the kind of lighting scenario where you're in your home, and you're, taking pictures, and there's some shadows here, shadows there, so on and so forth. But let's say that you want to use the telephoto. Well, the way it works with the telephoto is when you're talking about a zoom that's an economy, if it's in a well-lit situation, what you do is you simply add a 1 for each time you have a zoom to the multiplier that I gave you. Alright, so for the Nikon's 18-105 lens on the telephoto side, what would happen is that you would be adding in a well lit situation 6 to the 4, which means at the telephoto end of things, it's gonna, on average, depending on what you're trying to shoot, it will take that thing up to 5 seconds to be able to autofocus in a well lit situation with the 18-105. Now I say up to 5 seconds. The reason for this is that Nikon could have very well, made the d7100 where it actually helps to assist the 18-105 on the front end in terms of its telephoto versus the back end with its wide. One of the downfalls to the d7100 is the fact that the unit, of course, just did terrible with the 18-105 in terms of autofocusing. But realize if that's the case, the Pentax is still where the Nikon's going to take up to 5 seconds to autofocus on its telephoto end. Realize because the Pentax is using a performance-based lens, it still has a multiplier of 1 that you add per zoom, but it's only a 4 zoom we're talking about. Hence, that's going to put you at about a 0.4, 0.5. In other words, the Nikon takes up to 5 seconds to autofocus, okay, with its 18-105 in a normal lit situation, and the Pentax takes roughly about half a second to do this under the same restrictive circumstances. Now, what will impair the Nikon, of course, is going to be, is it dealing with, I want to say, awkward shadows and stuff like that. Because keep in mind, this camera is very weak when it comes to dynamic range. So that's why you get up to the, up to the 5 second mark. Now, if we were talking about a dim lit area, okay, if we're talking about a low lit area, then what's going to happen is that number for its economy lens is actually, instead of having a 1 added per zoom, it's going to be a 2 added per zoom to the multiplier, which effectively gives you 10 seconds out. And the Pentax would be, in turn, about a second, because it has a performance-based lens. As you can see here, there is no advantage that the Nikon D7100 gains in this overall setup. There just isn't. This isn't to say, that the Nikon D7100 is necessarily a bad unit. We're just saying that the unit is not as impressive as originally thought. So this is the test. We've looked at image quality. We looked at autofocusing speed. By the way, just so you guys know, both cameras shoot at 7 frames a second. The Nikon does it at a crop of 15.9 megapixels, which might as well be 16 megapixels. And the Pentax does it obviously at its full 16 megapixels. And we've also looked at, other things inside the camera in terms of, how the thing functions, just based on Nikon's concept of building a camera and Pentax's concept of building a camera. I'm not going to say that the Nikon D7100 is a bad unit. This is what I'm going to say. It strikes a note in Nikon's lineup that is really going to force certain other brands to step up to the plate, because Nikon is an international recognized brand when it comes to cameras. But at the same time, let's not kid ourselves, the Pentax K5 IIs whooped its ass. Okay, we can just be honest about this. There's no two ways about this. It drove it into the ground. In the end, it's your investment, and you'll make the pick of what you want to do and how you want to do it. But looking at this video, looking at the mechanics of both cameras, I know which one I would go with. So, you guys take care. I'll talk to you later. All right, bye-bye.